So if you haven't been paying attention to the news for the last couple weeks, or you're watching this 10 years from now or whatever, we recently, as we're coming close to the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, saw the United States do its final withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, and we've watched the Taliban, the government the United States invaded all those years ago in order to toss them out of power, reclaim the country almost instantaneously. The situation's moving so fast that in my notes here, I actually wrote it as a coming tragedy, but the tragedy's already quite here. And as this war that's cost hundreds of thousands of lives comes to a bloody end, the question about what comes next is floating in the air. The United States is almost a giant mercenary company with a small country attached to it, so they're going to need to find some way to justify, endless wartime footing. But what is it in this current position where the Cold War is over and the war on terror is basically over at this point? So what do? It does seem that as we find ourselves watching the collapse of this, house of cards, US puppet state government in Afghanistan, that the US is approaching the end of some chapter of its history. It's like the 9/11 era is officially over. So let's talk about what this period of history looked like, where it came from, how it rose, fell, and what's next. But before we go into, talking about the fate of the most powerful empire to have ever existed in the world, ads. All right, it's commercial time, guys, and I want to thank this video's sponsor, who has been a longtime supporter of Step Back, Skillshare. Skillshare, you guys know it. It's on all the YouTubes. It's a learning community where millions come together to learn about new skills like design, photography, freelancing, or, there's all sorts of stuff. It has a huge library where you can learn all sorts of stuff, and they have been putting a lot of effort lately into developing new courses. So as I come back every time, I find that they've made a lot of high quality Skillshare originals that are really interesting, and I just get to dive through and have a really good time. So I can personally attest that it is a very good value. Now, the latest course that I've been taking actually is probably reflected a little bit in the demeanor of this video. It's a course by Nathaniel Drew. It was actually a live stream, it seems, at some point, and it's about trying to get out of creative ruts. For the last maybe month or so, I've been feeling like I've been in a bit of a creative burnout type situation. And one of the things that I took as advice from the course was to change up the way you make videos, or just, shake things up. If you do things the same way over and over again, you're going to get stuck and you're going to fall into sort of a creative doldrum. And so I decided this time to work off of bullet points rather than a script. Hence why I'm a little bit more all over the place, maybe a little bit more conversational, but also a lot more, giving myself a whole lot more work on the other side of the filming. But yeah, that's the case. Skillshare class is actually giving me a lot of real world value. And if you want to learn how to get out of your creative rut, or you want to learn how to do something valuable like, Photoshop or, After Effects, or whatever it is that, you're trying to get into so that you can expand your career opportunities and things like that, Skillshare is offering to give the first 1,000 people who click the link in the description and in the top comment will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So, no risk. Try out some free classes. I guarantee you'll find something that will really give you some value and help advance your career. Thank you, Skillshare, for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the content. Hey, everybody, welcome to Step Back. Subscribe to me, maybe? It's my best sell right now. So let's outline what this period of history is that I'm talking about. So first, let's start with America at the end of World War II. The United States unquestionably came out as a mega superpower from World War II. They had overwhelmingly the most powerful industrial capacity of any country on Earth. They were producing almost half of all manufactured goods, mostly because they weren't the ones who were strategically bombed during the war. And also, the international security apparatus set up in the wake of World War I fell apart. The great empires of Europe had basically lost a lot of their capacity to even manage different international affairs, and America saw a lot of opportunities to expand, open up, and essentially take the role of all of those imperial powers. Furthermore, World War II spilled over into the Cold War with their rivals, the Soviet Union, and the growing movements of communists all over the globe. The United States unquestionably was the head of the capitalist powers during the Cold War. But then, a little under 50 years after the Cold War began, the Soviet Union fell. And after decades and decades of this growing, massive American military, you had a globe-spanning empire with no enemy, no target to focus on. And so there was a lot of questions about what would the United States do without the Soviet Union? What was the reason for having military bases across the world and a extremely over-bloated military budget? Well, you might find this interesting to know that in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was actually a bit of a call to possibly ramp back the American empire. And it was a popular idea. Now, American presidents, who work for their constituents, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, all the military contractors that basically run the United States, they needed to make sure that they did not have any bad quarters, but at the same time, peace was popular. So you had a string of presidents who spoke of having a smaller role in global affairs while continuing to have a massive role in global military interventions. George H.W. Bush, the president who oversaw the Soviet Union's collapse, spoke of a peace dividend, about a more, humble American foreign policy. But instead of doing that, he invaded Iraq and did the whole Gulf War thing on very dubious grounds. To show just how much things had changed, he only lasted one term. The next president, Bill Clinton, was notably a president who did not have foreign policy experience. It was considered a political liability. The American president during the Cold War was always considered somebody who was primarily dealing with international affairs, and domestic stuff wasn't that huge of a deal. But in the 90s, and the Cold War being over, the American people were much more interested in things like economics and xenophobia against people from, Latin America. So when Bill Clinton got elected, the topics were more about issues to deal with the economy rather than issues of war and peace. And Clinton, as president, did sort of ramp things back. The military budget actually shrank under Clinton. And in times when the United States, maybe in today's context, might have done a military intervention, they didn't. They withdrew from countries like Somalia. They did middling interventions in ethnic conflicts in Yugoslavia. And when the Rwandan genocide was happening, they did absolutely nothing at all. But they were still very invested in making sure that the United States was branded somehow as the main character of history, a country that needed to have a permanent imperial war footing that could never be ramped back in a very meaningful sense. And the most telling of this attempt to rebrand American imperialism came from a Today Show interview with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. "We have to use force," she said. "It's because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall and we see further than other countries into the future. And we see the danger here to all of us." This was because the United States was getting ready to bomb Iraq, by the way. It was a rebranding exercise to try and define what the United States would be without the Soviet Union. And the idea is the indispensable nation. What does that even mean? What is the indispensable nation? What is America's role? Well, soon after we were going to find out. There was this concept called rogue states, terms for countries that are going down some dark path that the United States, as the main character and superhero of the world, have a duty to intervene in order to save people. You've probably heard of this as like humanitarian interventionism or liberal interventionism or something like that. But the idea is that this enemy of rogue states were these limited regional threats that the US needed to get involved with. In many ways, this is the advancement of America the world's police. But a more cynical person might see this more for what it seemed to actually be, which is American imperialism, and interventions were more focused on attacking those who defied American hegemonic control. And a lot of people had questions over whether it was necessary to have a globe-spanning imperial network, military bases in hundreds of countries, and a massive budget dedicated to the weapons of war when, Americans don't have things like health care or tuition-free education or, other basic things that everyone should have. We are becoming drunk with the idea that we are the world's only superpower and therefore can do whatever we want to whomever we want. And, America as this overwhelming imperial power, this economy that can dominate all others, made a bit of sense after World War II, but in the years after World War II, the share of the world's GDP that the United States represented started to shrink, and by the 1990s, it had shrunk quite a bit. So the United States was committing itself more and more to a permanent military imperialist footing, while having less and less resources to do it. Usually they responded by cutting in everything else that wasn't the military. But the argument that the United States was able to justify doing the right thing all over the world because it just had this massive economy that other countries didn't was starting to become less and less true. And specifically, the major thing was that China was starting to grow in a massive way and establish itself as a major economic and strategic rival to the United States. In the 2000 election, George Bush criticized Clinton's aimless foreign policy, and argued in sort of a neocon way that the United States needed to refocus and really double down on its strategic importance. During the campaign, he said that America needs to act with more humility and with more strategic focus. And specifically, he decried a trend towards action without vision, activity without priority, and missions without end. Oof. It sounds like he's talking about stepping down the American empire, but it's actually more complaining that the American empire under Clinton's leadership didn't have a mission. And so we see this playing with what America's mission is going to be, redoubling the strategic effort in the early months of George Bush's presidency. A very interesting time, this period from Bush's inauguration to 9/11. Where they were trying to find what the Bush era was going to be. There was an incident in which a Chinese fighter jet collided with an intelligence plane that Donald Rumsfeld and a lot of the neocons who surrounded Bush were trying to push into a harder line with China and trying to set up sort of like a pseudo-Cold War against the People's Republic. But ultimately, Bush did not press that. He didn't try to make a hard line with China. But then, well...
Oh my God! Oh my God!
Yeah, 9/11. The topic that this video was supposed to be about before, everything went down. There are adults now who don't even remember 9/11 or were born after it happened. So I should probably just give a quick recap. 9/11 was the worst terrorist attack in American history. It was a coordinated attack by a radical Wahhabist group by the name of Al-Qaeda. They coordinated the hijacking of 4 airplanes and used them to crash into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., as well as one which is suspected to have been headed to the Capitol building, but the passengers overtook the hijackers and actually crashed the plane in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Including the hijackers, on that day, 2,996 people lost their lives. And this was a big mistake on the part of US security forces. The whole 9/11 Commission report outlines in extreme detail how America really f***ed up when it came to their security apparatuses, because this was an attack that had multiple signs that it was coming and was the end result of an organization that had already been growing more and more confident in bigger and bigger terrorist attacks over the past decade. It wasn't even the first time Al-Qaeda attacked the World Trade Center. These extreme Wahhabi Islamists were trained by the CIA and, given lots of money from the Pentagon to fight an insurgent war against Afghanistan's socialist government, which was being defended by the Soviet Union in an attempt to create the USSR's Vietnam. But after the fall of the socialist government, a man by the name of Osama bin Laden, who had a lot of connections to big money in Saudi Arabia, decided to start Al-Qaeda, which means the base, which is an organization that was supposed to connect resources and people between different radical groups across the world in order to fight against everybody else. And the United States had become their target because of the putting military bases in Saudi Arabia on what they considered holy ground, supporting Israel, and a myriad of other causes. Al-Qaeda had already carried out several terrorist attacks against US targets. I did a whole series on the history of Al-Qaeda that I will link to for you. But 9/11 was like the ultimate acceleration of it. And because of these holes in America's security apparatus, it went off surprisingly well. And old George Bush instantly saw the mission that America could focus on. Immediately after the attacks, the instant strategy was not to focus on how to make America safe, but about how to use this to turn America into the indispensable nation, or at least make the argument for it. And so, shortly after the attacks, the Bush administration clearly labeled that the attacks did not happen because of their interventions. It did not happen because they funded the Mujahideen. It didn't happen because of the various places where the US had just intervened where it shouldn't have. No. The reason why 9/11 happened was because of America's freedoms and dedication to democracy. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. And I remember directly after 9/11, it was forbidden to question this narrative. Anybody who said that the United States might have done something to bring upon this attack was, people's careers were destroyed for implying that there was even a possibility that the United States had done anything to bring upon this attack. But because America was the beacon of freedom in the world, it would always have enemies. And so America would always need to have a huge military. But in many ways, 9/11 was more the beginning of the end of this post-Cold War American indispensable nation narrative. Almost immediately after 9/11, even when it was quickly figured out that Al-Qaeda was the group responsible for doing it, and they were responsible for doing it, the US quickly worked to generalize it. The war was not against Al-Qaeda, because to fight Al-Qaeda, you would need to do counterterrorism operations. That would be raids, that would be intelligence, that would be trying to counter their fund lines and things like that. That doesn't make good, spectacular news. No, they needed a war. So they decided to declare war on terror. Sometimes they even said they were declaring war on evil. The Zoomers watching might not have memories of this, but the federal US White House government line was to straight-faced say they were declaring war on terror and declared enemies of the United States as part of what they called the axis of evil. And the axis of evil had no countries in it that were even close to the people responsible for 9/11. They had Iraq, a country that was secular, run by a Sunni leader, but a Shia majority country. You had Iran, the Islamic Republic. I guess you're getting closer there, but Iran is a Shia country, and Osama bin Laden was a Sunni radical. They would have no reason to work with each other, and all the reason to hate each other and try to kill each other. And the third country in the axis of evil was North Korea, a weird communist country on the other side of Asia. Donald Rumsfeld in an interview even said that they didn't want to focus on counterterrorism operations because they needed something to show that America was in charge. And so their first action after the 9/11 attacks, the invasion of Afghanistan, was a PR stunt. A PR stunt that would lead to a brutal and costly multi-decade occupation that killed hundreds of thousands of people. And that mission to root out al-Qaeda, catch Osama bin Laden and everything was scrapped almost immediately to demolish and completely rebuild the country of Afghanistan. And we're learning this week how well that turned out. And because even that war wasn't satisfying, Afghanistan didn't really have that contemporary military. There was no battles, there was no flash and bang. They needed to do another war so it could look better and look like America's even more in charge. So they went after a figure that has long been on the neoconservative wish list and invaded Iraq to overthrow Saddam Hussein and put in another government. And there was multiple reasons for this. Iraq had a more modern military, but not too modern of a military, so they could still look like it was, a real war with, tanks and airplanes and stuff. But the United States could still, with their, patented strategy of shock and awe, completely overwhelm them. They did try to make an excuse that Iraq was trying to get weapons mass destruction and was working with al-Qaeda. All of these were extremely flimsy and weak arguments, and everybody knew it. But the strength of the argument wasn't important. If anything, the arbitrariness of it was the point. They wanted to show that nobody was safe. America was the main character of the world, and every country existed because America gave them permission to. What America did, the world had to sit back and accept. Iraq was actually an illegal war. The UN said they couldn't do it. It was a war of aggression, but they did it anyway. If we follow international law, George Bush and all of the members of the Bush administration should be arrested by Interpol and put in front of the ICC. And I remember this period of the Iraq war because this is kind of when, teenage Tristan was starting to come online. And I remember that American elites lapped this shit up. For a while, there was open admiration of imperialism. And the mainstream journalists were the ones who cheerleaded this war. They sold all of the White House lies, even though they were very flimsy. They did no research. They just did stenography for the White House, essentially. And when the war happened, they talked about how great it was. They worshipped it. I always think about this period when liberals get very up in arms, just so concerned about how nobody takes the media seriously anymore and how that's the fault of other people, and that's the sign of the downfall of, everything. Brought it upon yourselves, friends. And so this period of vast American imperial growth, frenzy, would only last maybe a few years. By 2004, 2005, people started to become jaded and started to realize that, the war, at least the Iraq war, was a mistake. These wars kept dragging on. People kept dying. And the situation on the ground didn't seem to be getting better. And the war zones that America created by demolishing two countries and trying to prop up puppet governments created chaos and insurgency campaigns. These conflicts would spill over into other regions. And in order to not make Americans become fatigued of the war, they paid for it basically by putting America in a huge amount of debt. And as time moved on, Americans learned about horrors being committed on behalf of their country in places like the Abu Ghraib prison, where American soldiers tortured prisoners, or the Nisour massacre, where American paid mercenaries, for lack of a better word, killed tons of people. Found out about all the torture that was going on. And despite the best attempts of conservatives to try and defend torture, oh boy, was that a time. It was an ugly time. And support for this endless mission in the Middle East and in Central Asia was getting unpopular. And Barack Obama used opposition to George Bush and the Republicans to sail to a historic victory in 2008. Obama went to the similar line of presidents before Bush. He rhetorically said that America was just a nation among nations and that it was time to ramp back the war on terror. But, like George H.W. Bush and Clinton, that ramping back just meant a rebranding of pretty much the exact same thing, if not an expansion. In fact, using drone warfare, Obama massively expanded the war on terror into multiple new fronts. And because it was being done by robot airplanes, American soldiers weren't coming back in caskets. And it's kind of hard to get Americans to care about collateral damage of innocent people on the other side of the world. Obama also campaigned on doubling down on Afghanistan as the good war. And under his administration, he pushed for a surge of troops in Afghanistan. In many ways, Obama's approach to Afghanistan felt a lot like LBJ's approach to Vietnam. There was no way to win, but they refused to lose. The war on terror, as silly as it was rebranded into a war on violent extremism. Again, another war about something that's pretty much a universal part of the human experience. And in the same vein, the same stuff happened. The war grew and grew and grew in scope, with its mission becoming less and less apparent, to the point where even in some cases, like in Libya and Syria and in Yemen, the United States was working with Al-Qaeda. So there was a large disillusionment. George Bush started an endless war that everyone stopped believing in. Obama got elected on ending those wars and then just continued them anyway. So then came along Donald Trump. Donald Trump was probably the first president in American history to completely do away with the idea of American exceptionalism. In fact, he talked blatantly about how he believed that America was like a third world country. He wanted to get away from this idea of America as the indispensable main character nation and just kind of lay it out for what it really was. He wanted to push Americanism. This wasn't about making the world a better place. This was about militarily dominating the world to advance specifically American interests. The whole moral crusader thing was basically just thrown away. And what I find very interesting about this, and I think it says a lot about America and also specifically American liberals, is that functionally, when it came to war and peace and, foreign interventions, Donald Trump actually wasn't that dissimilar from any other American president. The only thing that was significantly different between Trump and, a normal US president was more in affect and rhetoric. It was all in branding and the words used, not in the actions done. And in many ways, Donald Trump was a lot more honest about what America's role in the world was than many other presidents. And how a lot of the people who really, really hated Donald Trump, now that Joe Biden's elected and doing virtually the exact same things when it comes to foreign policy, have gone quiet. So, it's pretty apparent that to a lot of American liberals specifically, Trump's issue wasn't the fact that he was doing horrible things, and he was doing horrible things. It was that he was being rude. Because Biden's president now, and he's continued most of the things that Trump has done, and those same people have all of a sudden stopped caring about the kids in cages. Stopped caring about, the use of military force. God, that's sad. But now the US is at a bit of a crossroads. The occupation of Afghanistan is over. The Taliban are back in charge. The entire war on terror, for all of the blood and treasure it cost, amounted to nothing. When Biden left the White House, one of the things that he hoped is that America would continue to uphold its reputation as the indispensable nation. If anything we've learned is that making America indispensable to the destiny of Afghanistan was a massive mistake. But in many ways, it seems that the United States is back to where it was at the end of the Cold War. Except this time it doesn't have the international reputation of being the guardians of freedom and capitalism across the world. The war on terror and the Trump administration sort of laid bare. Any goodwill that the world has towards the United States is gone at this point. But here's the thing. America is a government by and for the people. who are on the board of directors of Raytheon, and they need to sell knife missiles to the Pentagon to have a good quarter next year. So the United States does need to grow its military budget and have a permanent war footing, but for what? And that's what I think is the interesting question here. And I don't have an answer, sadly, in that what's next? Joe Biden, or like, the dozens of Grima Wormtongues whispering to Joe Biden, have a very big decision to make in the next few years about what the nature of this mercenary group is going to be next. The next and most obvious mission that it seems, at least the Biden administration is going to try, is to start a Cold War with China. But that would be very dangerous. China is a nuclear armed state. And China is a country that is on the ascent, while America is very clearly on the descent. So if the United States tried to do Cold War II and attempted to strong-arm countries across the world to choose between them or China, I don't think they'd win as many of those as they think they would. And, if they were asking me, America could definitely lead the world when it comes to truly global issues that America has the resources to really make a dent on, like climate change. They could be a global leader of the world on climate change. They could be the global leaders of vaccinating the entire world against COVID-19 and preventing another pandemic from happening. But you can't drone bomb COVID into submission. Believe me, if you could, America would have cured the pandemic ages ago. There's no show of force when dealing with climate change. There's no spectacle. Brian Williams can't talk about the majesty of your weapons when what you're doing is trying to address climate change. Just thinking about what it would be like if America used its drones to drop like food and medicine and vaccines on the developing world instead of, missiles. But Lockheed Martin can't make quarterly profits off that. So what are we seeing here? What is the, next step? Because I don't know. So as we leave the 9/11 era, what we're sort of leaving is the America as indispensable country period. I don't know, I'm a historian. We're notoriously bad at naming things. But in my mind, it seems that in the broader history of this little period of American foreign policy, that 9/11 is the Act 3, the event that signified the beginning of the end. But as for what happens next, Biden, the United States, I have no clue. I'll be watching the news to find out along with the rest of you.